Uh, extreme complications happening again and again in episode 3. I've scrapped it, and we're going right to episode 4. I couldn't do it anymore. That character's gone too. It's just that whole thing is
I had felt it far off, similar to a pre-storm migraine for months.
and ruin things.
Like some force in the world had plans for us that we didn't know about but could see forming. The pregnancy had been rocky from the start, not to mention how many IVF treatments that it took. It felt like both our lives had been on some rickety train track, somehow still clinging to the edges. I mean, neither of us were ready, and we both knew it. It was like a third person was already in the room, constantly waiting to be introduced, so they could talk some sense into us. Jules was getting worked to the bone at the hospital over the past year, understaffed and underpaid. She took time off as soon as she could when the pregnancy was confirmed. She told me that she had similar feelings as I did, like something was coming, not just a baby. She kept saying that she just wanted me home, on the couch beside her at night, my hands on hers as she massaged her growing belly. That was all that she needed for comfort. I was a beat cop and dragged my feet on asking for the time off. So fate stepped in and ushered me along in a way that I couldn't imagine. It was a Friday and I was going to talk to the staff sergeant at the end of the shift, but I had received a call to the local junior high school. There was a shooting in progress. 2 active shooters with small explosives. I pulled into the parking lot of the school and saw smoke billowing from the windows and fire lashing out from within. I rushed to the back doors of the school but found them chain locked from the inside. I could see that there was a thick padlock keeping it shut. Gunfire, screams, and small explosions rang out from inside. Smoke was creeping out from under the doors. I radioed back. They said tactical was 4 minutes away. Another officer, O'Reilly, was a minute out though, and to wait on him before breaching, we wouldn't be able to help the kids inside the door anyway. The IR training that we did, immediate action, rapid deployment, was very clear that in high-risk situations, our only intent was to take out the shooter. Run fast and shoot straight. Early contact is key. It was a concept that came out in the wake of Columbine. First responders were no longer setting up a perimeter, or even trying to help those wounded. Located and neutralizing the shooters was our lone purpose. The crying on the other side of the door had turned to whimpering. The banging had stopped. I took the time. A minute had passed and no sign of O'Reilly. He was probably stopping at green lights. He was the type of cop who actively avoided any call that required him getting out of his cruiser. Wherever he was, I bet he was monitoring the radio, and he wouldn't show up until after tactical had arrived. The whimpering on the other side of the door went quiet. I couldn't wait any longer. I had already waited too long. I ran back to my cruiser and got my pack. Bolt cutters, a pry bar, additional vests to protect from their high-powered rifles. I speared the pry bar into the meshy window. The glass cubed away, but I had to tear through the thick metal netting. The smoke poured out and all the sounds of the horrors inside came rushing to meet me. I could barely see inside, but managed to find the padlock and snapped it with the bolt cutters. I yanked the door open and 2 tiny bodies spilled out. They had been the ones that pressed against the door whimpering. They were gone now. I wanted to go home. I wanted to shut the blinds to the world and disappear forever. It would be so easy to just turn back now. Wait for tactical since O'Reilly must have gotten lost. A scream pierced out from inside and pulled me back to the doorway. I could see more bodies hazy through the smoke. I pulled my Glock and I slid in through the door, finding destruction like I couldn't imagine. My senses were overwhelmed. The air reeked of cordite so heavily that I felt like it was coating my lungs. My ears were ringing from the gunfire and explosions overhead. The smoke detectors were screeching in short bursts, adding to the ringing. Some had been shot off the ceiling, but still squeaked out a distorted alarm. And the walls, the ones that I could see, looked like they had been painted red. The smoke hung in the air like a storm cloud. The hallway floor was lined with bodies, tiny backpacks strapped to them. What a weapon can do to a body is indescribable. I walked towards the end of the hallway where a staircase led up. The gunfire and explosions were coming from the second floor, so that's where I was going. I made my way down the hall, ducking just below the smoke line and keeping my eyes trained away from the floor. I was 10 feet away from the staircase when the war zone upstairs went quiet. Gunfire, explosions, screams. It all muted out. Only the occasional and distorted smoke detectors pierced the silence. I kept moving. A new sound startled me, causing me to nearly fire off my gun. It was a cell phone chime, muffled out from underneath one of the bodies. And then another ringtone, and another and another. A chorus of phone calls were coming in to various cell phones, and all I could think was how sad I was for the parents who would never hear their children's voices pick up on the other end, or ever again. And my heart broke for them all. All the parents who had dropped off their kids in the morning, not knowing that they were saying goodbye. And then I heard whistling, laughter, joking and talking. Two voices, males, they were coming down the staircase. I took a knee to the left of the stairs and I trained my Glock on the stairway entrance. I was off to the side just enough that they wouldn't see me until after I had seen them. The laughter got closer, echoing down the halls. The whistling started again. He was reciting the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. My finger rested against the trigger. I was ready. The laughing and whistling harmonized together now to the same tune, echoing louder and closer. I trained my gun at head level. No, chest level. Two in the chest, but the first one down and then the second. But what if there's a third? The footsteps hit the last row of stairs. 2 sets of footsteps, only 2. My gun was hair-triggered on the entryway. Pop Goes the Weasel got louder, more disturbed. 2 shadows appeared in the entrance. My finger hovered on the trigger but didn't pull. And then they appeared in the doorway. Both had been dressed in skeleton print suits and carried chest kits and ammo vests with additional handguns to accompany the rifles. They both appeared to be late teens. I couldn't see their faces. The first one hand-painted on a clown face, with an exaggerated, toothy grin up his cheeks. It was frightening, as the rest of his face was smeared with red ink. The other kid had a Hannibal Lecter mask on, and it was smeared with blood, which I couldn't tell was real or fake. They saw me as soon as I saw them, but all 3 of us froze. I had the drop on them, my Glock already leveled at my target. They smiled and dropped their guns and held out their wrists to be handcuffed. Arrest us. You'll be the hero, they said tauntingly. I couldn't take them in. I didn't think about whether they had explosive charges on them that could have been blown up, not only us, but possibly even the entire school. I didn't think about how prison would be for them for the rest of their lives if I brought them in. All I could think was how much I wanted them buried under the prison and erased from history. I put 2 in the Smiling Teen's chest and 2 in the Hannibal kid's chest. They both went down hard. I felt rage take over completely, and I unloaded the rest of the magazine between the 2. I peppered their faces, and I didn't want them to have an open casket. I never wanted anyone to see these 2 again. I was put on leave as SIU came in to investigate. I was brought in multiple times. Interviews racked my days, and there was very nearly a criminal case against me by the parents of the shooters. They had a reasonable case against what I did. I just can't imagine having the nerve to bring it forward after what their children had done. I had been off work ever since, which had been the plan before, just not in this way. Nightmares haunted me. All of them were with the two boys. I was older in the dream, and somehow I knew that I had a daughter in an upstairs classroom, but I couldn't get to her. The floors were wet cement, and I felt like my muscles had been stripped from my legs. The dream would always end with a chase to get to her, and I always lost. There were a few weeks where I was almost positive that I was going to jail. The lawyer had called and told me prosecution was seeking 5 years for each of the kids, and a massive lawsuit against the force. But in the last week, it all crumbled away. It turned out to be a pie-in-the-sky hope from the prosecution, and I was let off but put on leave with mandatory weekly visits to a behavioral psychologist to start immediately. I figured that was a fair trade, even though I was feeling more and more like I didn't belong in the force. The investigation coming up clean was a gift and a lesson. I didn't belong there. What I was going to do now, I had no idea. I had some time to decide, and with Jules pregnant, our hands would be full for a while. With us both home now, I had seen changes in Jules as the pregnancy wore on. More and more, I would find her in the baby's room, holding up the tiny onesies over her belly, the little socks and the beanie caps, looking through the picture books that we would eventually entertain her with, getting used to the sway of the rocking chair. There is a basket filled with yarn and sewing needles that Jules put together and had been learning over the past few weeks. She was embracing it all, despite the dark cloud that we had felt lingering. It was Friday, and we had gone in for Jules' last checkup before delivery next week. I had been dreading it, thinking that something would come up, something unavoidable or unfixable. But the baby was perfect. Our little girl was healthy and ready to be delivered on her due date. On our way home from the OBGYN, I noticed the Wakewood subway station was closed off. In fact, the whole street was. There were white vans and trucks and scientists in hazmat suits, and a strong military presence. Normally, I wouldn't be nervous about something like this, but the station was a block away from our apartment building. What was more strange, I didn't see any news stations nearby. Not one reporting on anything. When we got home, I checked for any updates about Wakewood. Nothing from any major, medium, or minor news network. All I found were a few posts from randoms on Twitter, which were shadow banned or quickly taken down. And just as my interest had peaked, there was a knock at the window. Although we were 6 stories up, this was far from abnormal. Rick, our neighbor from the apartment next door, was on the balcony that we shared, which was separated by a large piece of frosted glass. We joked that we were kind of like each other's Wilsons from Home Improvement. I joined him on the balcony and bummed a drag from his cig over the partition. I was happy to see Rick and figured that he would have some wild idea about what was going on. He worked for the city, but thrived on conspiracy theories and had his finger on the pulse. He was never less than interesting and wasn't insulting or condescending. As it turned out, he had a huge scoop on what was happening. I tried to keep up, but he spoke fast, overwhelming me with information. Sometimes it felt like that was part of how he came across as persuasive. Every word and sentence marched out like a perfectly thorough and thought-out idea. He spoke well and found the right words to make you question what you previously believed. Rick claimed that there was a viral leak. Down by the water in the industrial district, there are several large warehouses that contain some kind of secret government facility. At one of the warehouses in a gain-of-function lab, A vicious strain of experimental pathogen had gotten out. An infected lab worker left work, got in the subway, and made it 5 stops before getting off and dying on the tracks. The worker apparently had started screaming and jumped over the edge as a new subway was coming into the station. They were trying to do contact tracing by using face identifying technology, with the CCTV footage throughout the trains and the platforms. I asked Rick how he knew this, and he said that he had people working with the city that were feeding him details as they happened. Rick himself was an electrician and was constantly in and out of the subway systems. In fact, he told me that he was sneaking in later. He had his own hazmat suit and clearance through the city, and if he got turned away, he said that he would creep in through the sewers. He said that he knew some secret routes through the city. And with that, Jules came out and the conversation turned towards the pregnancy and next week's birth. Rick said that he bought our soon-to-be-born daughter a bottle of whiskey for her 18th birthday, so it'll age nicely by the time that she opens it. Jules and Rick went on, but I kept thinking about what Rick had said about the Wakewood station. It all seemed scary and true. He had been persuasive again, and I felt anxiety creeping back in. During dinner, the speaker that we were using to listen to Spotify turned off. I checked my cell, but I found no bars. Jules checked hers, and it was the same. Our wireless router wasn't picking up any signal. I turned on the TV, and every channel had the same thing on a bright yellow screen. It was a warning. The downtown core was under strict and immediate lockdown. No one was to leave their homes under any circumstances. We were to leave the TV on for further instruction. As they came, Jules and I were in disbelief, her more than I. I was thinking back to the conversation with Rick, and how much more sane it was sounding. I wanted to see what he thought about all of this. When I banged on the wall we shared with him, I got nothing back. That meant that Rick was there in the subway systems, either discovering what was happening or being discovered. I looked out the window and I peered into the other apartment buildings. They were all filled with the yellow lights from the TV screen warning. Everyone was staring helplessly at the same thing. This was real. We talked about going to our neighbors down the hall or on other floors and to see if they had heard anything. We decided to stay inside for the night and watch a Blu-ray. We wanted to get our minds off of what was happening and towards the excitement of next week. But it was impossible. We went to bed early, but just laid there. We were spooning and I knew that she was awake too. Our hands were in their 90 spot, linked together on top of her pregnant belly. I could feel the baby moving around most nights. But tonight was interrupted by knocks at the window in the living room. It was Rick, and he was back. I went to meet him out on the balcony. He was panicking, covered in sweat like he had just run a marathon, which seemed at least half right. He had gotten into the subway station, and he had learned things. As he started, I was noticing how sweaty he had gotten. He was coughing and his nose was running. If whatever he was talking about was a virus, he looked to have the most common symptoms. I asked him to calm down and speak slowly. He took a breath and he laid it out. Rick claimed that he was wrong, kind of, and that it wasn't biochemical medical labs in the warehouses. It was a series of testing facilities for advanced particle accelerators. A defense contractor had built a groundbreaking new hadron collider to test the limits of cosmic acceleration in dark matter. It started with the creation of microscopic quantum black holes. They had been pushing the accelerator further, its reach far exceeding our known laws of nature, of reality. Something came out of one of the black holes before the accelerator was shut down. The CDC had been brought in quickly to contain and study. What they had discovered was something like a virus. At least that's how they were referring to it. But it wasn't like anything anyone had ever known of. It was both physiological and psychological. It was being referred to as Pandemia 115. It appeared that when you became infected, it started with a migraine, chills, and a fever. Then the hallucinations start. You'll hear things first, see things, and it will keep pushing them on you. The virus comes in 3 waves of those over the course of a 9-hour lifespan. It operated by latching into our nervous system and adrenal glands, feeding off our naturally occurring cortisol spikes during fear responses. The hyper-intelligent virus finds our most personal, fear-inducing thoughts, and it supercharges them, strengthening itself as we grow weaker. In the end, the virus burns the host out with a fever of 115. And what was worse, it had an 80% infection fatality rate. Rick went into a hacking coughing fit, which he then blamed on too many cigarettes. But it didn't look like that. It looked like his body was trying to fight something off and it was losing. I was getting more nervous. Whether or not the Hadron Collider thing was accurate or not, there was some kind of virus or bacteria that caused a massive citywide lockdown. And good or bad, Rick was our only current source of information. A spotlight hit our window from below and yelling from a megaphone bellowed up from the street. Voices ordered us back inside, under threat of immediate arrest. I rushed in and right into Jules. She had been there at the doorway to the balcony listening. We ducked down and shut the door. The spotlights turned off and the eerie stillness of the quiet downtown returned. Jules and I whispered to each other. She told me that she had heard most of what Rick had said, and it all sounded crazy. I agreed, but something was happening. Footsteps and movements came from the stairs down the hall. I heard more orders being barred, and then boards being put up against the doors. Nail guns firing off. They were locking all of us into our apartments. I went to the door to confront them, yelling that there was a pregnant woman inside. But there was no response, and before I could open the door, it was bolted shut. They had locked down our whole floor and then moved on to the next one. And we listened as they went through our entire building. We looked out the windows, keeping far enough away from the edges, and we saw large teams of scientists and military personnel. They were all in hazmat suits, carrying medical equipment, nail guns, and bolting equipment, or semi-automatic rifles. They also had body bags. The side of our wall erupted in banging. It was Rick, and it sounded like he was going to come right through into our apartment. He started screaming, most terrified, unsettling shrieks of absolute fear. I yelled to him, even banged back from our side, but Rick continued screaming and thudding his side of the wall. And then the thudding stopped. The screaming continued, but it moved through Rick's apartment. A second later, we heard glass shattering, and then a sick, horrifying thud on the pavement below. We rushed to the window and saw Rick's body splayed out on the pavement. Hazmat suits moved in with large hoses and sprayed a cement-like liquid which solidified in seconds after covering his body. Spotlight hit his window and ours again. We dropped back down, hiding below the frame. After a moment, the spotlight disappeared and darkness resumed. We could hear workers below sterilizing and cleaning up the blood splatter from Rick's body. Jules was crying quietly, trying to hide it. Not that she needed to. I was shook and felt my stomach doing somersaults. We couldn't wrap our heads around how quickly our lives had changed since this morning. We decided to pull the shades in our bedroom and hope for a better tomorrow, but neither of us could sleep. Our Wi-Fi was out, so we couldn't listen to music or anything. So we pulled out our phones and went through all the photos that we had together. We had each taken pictures of mostly some other times and events. So it was fun to see and compare the ones we decided to hold on to individually. It put us into a better mood and we started to kiss. It was all interrupted by a cell phone ringtone. It was coming from the living room. And it wasn't one of our phones. I got up confused, and Jules was even more puzzled up at me. She couldn't hear anything. As I got to the bedroom door, another cell phone chimed out. It was the SpongeBob theme song. And then another tune joined in. This one from a different kid's show. I entered the living room as 4, 5, 6 new cell phones joined in. A chorus had begun. And they all hit the same harmony that I heard before. Back in the school hallway, filled with kids and their never-ending ringtones. On the floor of the living room were a pile of bloody cell phones, all ringing out with the screens displaying the words, "Call from Mom or Dad." Jules sidled up next to me, worried. She didn't hear the cell phones or see them. Pain streaked through my brain, and I couldn't think as a migraine took control. I stumbled back onto the couch. Jules dropped down next to me, putting her hands on me to comfort. And that was when I realized that I was freezing. And I mean that dead of deep north winter freezing. A blanket was thrown over me quickly. Jules was trying to warm me up. And like a cloud of fog dissipating, the migraine had loosened its hold. It was replaced by something else. Whatever was out there infecting people, I had it. And the first wave was about to start. The fever rocked my body. I had never felt so hot, like I was on fire inside and out. Jules got me into the shower and blasted the cold water. I laid in the tub, hyperventilating. As tears overwhelmed Jules, she put her face in her hands. This was all too much for both of us. And then the sobbing and tears had changed, almost imperceptibly, but it continued to shift. Like a staticky TV channel coming into reception. It wasn't crying anymore. It was laughter. Slowly, Jules started pulling her hands away from her face. But it wasn't her face anymore. It was like a child. Old and twisted. Broken and rearranged like a real-life Dr. Seuss character. Her lips pulled back into a giant smile, and her teeth began to elongate. No, they were falling out. Being pushed out by larger, sharper teeth. Her lower jaw unhinged and extended down, revealing rows of other sharper teeth and a deep, black chasm of her throat. The frightening child stood up, looking down at me in the tub. I wanted to get up and get out, but I had dream legs and nothing was working. I managed to grab the shower curtain, just as the child had jumped down on me, and I blocked her. I felt my legs get their strength back, and I flipped the body off me. I shot up and out of the bathroom. Footsteps followed me out into the hallway and I ran into the bedroom. I slammed the door shut, but when I turned back, I wasn't in Jules' into my bedroom. I was in my childhood basement. The lone, finicky light bulb overhead twitched on and off, just like it always used to. My eyes stayed away from the back corner of the basement, but I could just see something poking out of the shadows. The 2 silver protective bars that made up the cage at the front of a football helmet. My heart turned into a machine gun. The rest of me was paralyzed. The helmet. My dad's old high school football helmet. A fear that had long been forgotten suddenly overwhelmed me with a horrifying nostalgia. The helmet shifted. Something moved it. Something inside of it. And buzzing, so faint at first, but it grew louder. The helmet vibrated with the sound. I heard wings begin to hum. I knew what was in there, and I took off for the stairs up. I got halfway up before they began to elongate, stretching upward into infinity. The stairs below me shifted into a ramp, and my legs went down. I managed to catch myself, and I pressed my legs and arms against the opposing walls, though, preventing myself from sliding down. Below, the helmet rolled past the staircase, buzzing emanating from it. The buzzing stopped. In the shadows, I heard what sounded like hands on the cement floor, slapping skin, hitting the ground as they moved something forward. The child with the lower jaw came into view now, crouched down on all fours like a wild animal about to attack. The lower jaw hung only inches from the ground. The upper part of her face was alternating between the demented child and Jules. The words, "My baby's hungry," croaked out from the open cavern of her mouth, and then she darted up the flat stairs towards me, still on all fours. Within seconds, she was over top of me, her jaw about to clamp down around my head. And then everything disappeared, and I was back in our apartment. I was on the floor of the bathroom and Jules was performing CPR on me. I felt like my lungs had been used to run back-to-back marathons and my heart had been in a pain shaker. I was jittery and panicked, my eyes darting around the room looking for predators. But none came. The first wave was over and I barely made it through. It felt exactly like Rick had said. And with that, the frightening realization that Jules was likely going to have it now too. And with the baby in her belly. It couldn't have been more than a minute later when Jules keeled over, gently rubbing her temples. The migraine had started. I watched as the chills swept across her body, then the fever. Then for a moment she seemed lucid and fine. She said that she felt better. But then she started to talk to someone in the corner of the room. It wasn't in a language though. It sounded like she had forgotten how to speak. Something similar had been happening over the last few weeks though. She had called it pregnancy brain, and said that her mind would get foggy sometimes when she was trying to think of a word. But this was different. This was gibberish, and frightened gibberish at that. And Jules stood up in bed and screamed into the corner in fear. I tried to calm her down, but she jumped off the bed and ran into the hallway. I chased after her and found her in the kitchen. She was rifling through the utensil drawer and found a pair of scissors, and she had the pointed end at her belly, and was yelling at someone behind her. I froze, afraid to move and cause her to panic. She didn't seem to see me, so I moved in slowly, planning to somehow get the scissors from her hand. I was almost at her when her attention turned from over my shoulder to right at my eyes. She pulled the scissors away, raising them above her head, and slashing at me with them. I managed to catch her wrist and twist it until she had dropped the shears. I grabbed her other wrist and pulled her down carefully, being mindful of the baby. I held Jules tight as she squirmed against me, trying to get away. Slowly, her fighting had eased, and I felt her body going limp. Her breathing slowed, and then she shuddered and came to. She was back, awake. Jules was trembling. Whatever she had seen had shaken her to the core. I carried her to the couch and we got as comfortable as we could. A scream from one of the apartments above us broke the momentary serenity, and then another one somewhere on the floors below. There was banging on the walls and the floors and the ceiling. We could hear fighting, more screams and cries for help. They all slowly faded away, and silence returned. Time had passed quickly. I didn't really realize it, but the first wave had been far longer than the hallucination I remembered. I tried to prepare myself for the next wave, wondering what the heck it was going to come after me with. After all, it had found my childhood fear of my parents' basement, the football helmet, and the moth inside of it. I was only 8 when it had happened, but it felt like a defining moment. I had been playing in my parents' basement when I had stumbled upon my father's old high school football helmet. I slid it over my head and I strapped it on. What I didn't know was that there was a baby moth inside of it. The tiny creature panicked and ended up flying into my ear. It crept further in as I thrashed about, trying to pull off the helmet, but the strap clip jammed. It was stuck on my head. I pulled and pulled, but it wasn't budging. And the whole time, all I could hear was the humming and attempted buzzing of the moth as it kept going deeper. My mom found me screaming and took me to the hospital. The little insect had burrowed in so deep that I had to get it surgically removed. The buzzing and the humming haunted me for months. I had nightmares about the moth laying eggs in my brain. My parents kept telling me that it was a baby and it couldn't carry any eggs yet, but I didn't believe them. Thinking back on it, remembering the details, made me more afraid of the virus and what it would find in my psyche. My memory raced through the minefield that was my past. Not just being a cop, which I had done for half a decade and had seen horrible things as it became new fears, but all kinds of things from my teenage years, my childhood. Jules nuzzled her head under my chin. For a second, I forgot about the world and I enjoyed the moment. But like everything else, it couldn't last. I felt that lightning bolt of pain strike through the center of my head. I curled forward, rubbing my temples, knowing that it was about to start all again. The chills creeped in as the migraine eventually dissipated. Chills were colder this time. Somehow, I could see my own breath like the air in my lungs were frosted. That quickly melted away as the fever was tagged in. It felt like I was sitting in a bonfire in the middle of the Sahara Desert, wearing 10 fur coats while pouring gas on myself. It lasted for what felt like an hour. But then it too was gone. And Jules helped me get from the cold shower back to the couch. Not a moment after I hit the couch, a lone scream pierced out from one of the floors above. It was from a child. I asked Jules if she had heard it, but she had disappeared. Only the distant echo of her voice remained. I wasn't in our apartment anymore. I was back in the junior high school. I was sitting in a classroom chair, one of those small ones with a tiny desk attached to it. I was surrounded by bodies. Students stacked high and formed into a tightly packed maze. It was a horrific sight. I realized I was the same age as these kids, 12, maybe 13. A tune whistled out from somewhere in the maze. Pop goes the weasel. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. And then another whistle joined in, but this one was from a different direction. They harmonized together. A low hum joined in, a buzzing. The only thing that I could think of doing was the only thing that I had ever been taught about mazes. It was the wall follower rule. It was simple enough. If you put your right hand on the wall and you walk, it will eventually lead you to the exit. I had to learn this the hard way when I was a kid. I had gotten lost in a corn maze at a Halloween fair in the country. It wasn't supposed to be for kids, but I had wandered in and I wasn't found for over an hour. I was terrified when they had pulled me out. I thought there were things amongst the corn, creatures coming for me. The virus had found that memory, that fear, and seized on it. I wouldn't put my hands on the wall of the bodies, but I held it out close to it and I started off through the maze. The whistling was further off now. The two were sounding closer together, like they had found each other. I kept going. The maze pathway led me out of the class and into the gymnasium. Smoke hung in the air, reeking of cordite from the gunfire. There were bodies hanging from the rafters above. It was dark, but I could tell that they were the teachers. Crying was coming from somewhere in the middle of the maze, my legs leading me towards it. Everything felt like it had that surreal, constantly forward-moving momentum that dreams always carry. Like whether you're walking or standing still, you're basically on a conveyor belt to wherever your subconscious is taking you next.
Thanks, man.
My right hand was still stretched out to the wall of bodies, and tiny hands were brushing against it as I passed. The pathway grew narrower and taller as I got closer to the crying. I heard rustling above and I looked up. The teachers were now lowering down from the rafters and into the maze with me. They were joining in with the whistling from the boys, causing a loud echo throughout the gym. I tried to pick up my pace, but I had no control over it. The whistling was overwhelming, and mixed in with it, I could hear the children's ringtones joining. Humming and buzzing came from the sides of the walls, and There was movement amongst these stacked up bodies. I turned a corner and I found myself in a dead end. But I wasn't alone. There was a little girl there and I recognized her immediately. It was Jules. I had seen pictures of her as a child. Not that I needed to identify her. She had that same face, just 15 years younger. She asked if I was here to save her. I said that I was, but didn't know how to. She took my hand and told me just being there was enough. The whistling and the ringtones got closer. Jules led me back down the path that we had just came. But there was now a fork in the lane leading off to the left. The sounds were coming from the path to the right, so we went left. The maze led us out of the gymnasium and into a large room with an indoor pool. It was the Crestview Community Center. I remembered it from my childhood. I had taken swimming lessons here and I nearly drowned. Before I could ask her why she took me here, young Jules grabbed my hands tighter and pulled me over the edge. We were both fully submerged, her pulling me down to the bottom. But I had managed to break free from her grip and I swam to the surface. And then I saw them, pouring in through the entrance. All of the dead students and teachers surged into the pool. They were coming for me. I tried to swim again, but the water was thick and my body felt like dead weight. I wasn't moving. Hands grabbed every part of me as the bodies swarmed me, pulling me down into the now blood-filled pool. And the last thing that I saw before going under were the two shooters standing at the edge of the pool laughing. Their hands were out in front of them, and the same handcuff me officer gesture. Dozens, hundreds of hands pulling me to the bottom of the pool, which I couldn't even see anymore. It felt like we were in the ocean. It was impossible to fight against, but I kept kicking and punching and thrashing against them. I kept thinking of Jules back home on the couch, waiting for me to wake back up. Their grips became weaker as I continued to fight back. I felt myself getting closer to the surface, pushing through bodies and pulling away from their hands. Just as my breath was about to run out, I burst through the surface, and I shot up beside Jules on the couch, gasping for air. She was still under, trembling with fresh vomit dripping from her mouth and chin down her chest. I wiped the vomit away and tried to clear her throat, but there were no obstructions. Her airways were open, breathing fast but unimpeded. I didn't know what to do. All I could think was to pull her close, hand in hand, and rub both over her belly. The trembling got worse, heavier. Jules felt like she was starting to have a seizure. Her head shook back in violent jerks and then she froze, head back mid-scream. Her chest wasn't moving up and down from breathing. Jules gasped forward, nearly had fallen into the coffee table, but I caught her. Jules was awake and she was alive. We both were. And before she had managed to catch her breath, she was sobbing, a terribly sad weep. I couldn't imagine what she had just seen and been shown. She's a triage nurse after all, and had been one for longer than I had been a cop. I only heard some of the more filtered stories, and they were absolute horror shows. But I didn't want to think about those. I wanted to clear my mind of anything the virus could use. We got up, rehydrated, and did a small cleanup, which felt unnecessary now and more of a point of attempted orderliness than anything. There were another 3 hours until dawn. We figured that the next wave was going to hit soon, which also meant we would be coming out of it to the sun rising. We really didn't have much time. We decided that we didn't want to be found on the couch if we didn't make it. Jules put on her wedding dress, ripping the sides of it so it could fit over her pregnant belly. I put on the tux that I wore. I moved the TV into the bedroom, and we put on a movie that we both grew up watching, The Princess Bride. We laughed at the same jokes at the same times. We always did. It was our movie. I thought about last week, how difficult things had been, how afraid I was. It all felt so small now. I was making deals with any god that was listening to let us get through this, and I'd be grateful for every breath that I took afterwards. And with that, the wedding scene had started. Only the characters weren't in a church. They were in the junior high school hallway. The audience members were the children and teachers, racked with bullet holes. The princess and Wesley were now the two shooters. A ground-shaking migraine, a frozen chill, and a scorching fever tore through my body at the same time, exploding in waves through my muscles. It was unbearable, like the virus had saved everything up to unleash on me at once. The TV screen began to expand, covering the entire wall and pushing towards us on the bed. Jules was beginning to seizure, blood streaming from her nose. I tried to grab her, but she sunk into the bed and disappeared. The TV screen absorbed the entire room, which was now the school hallway. I was alone now. Raindrops started falling. A massive storm cloud had replaced the ceiling, now much higher than 20 feet above. Bolts of electricity fired through it, lighting up shadows of creatures inside, resembling large, frightening insects. Moss. Buzzing overtook the thunder as the rain came down in sheets. I started to run, slipping and sliding along the blood and rains like tiling. The hallway was extending, and it was adding more doorways as it was. I saw horrific memories of all my own traumas coming back. There were monsters from comics that I had read and movies that I had seen as a kid. The old petrified tree in my neighbor's yard that I used to think would swoop down and grab me if I ever walked by it alone. Swarms of large insects and carnivorous moss. The virus had found them all. I felt like I was in a car, whipping past memories and fears. As I sprinted past the doors, they began spilling out behind me like some thick, twisted clown car full of nightmares. My terrors chased me, gaining in numbers with every door. I realized my whole life was one big fear. I felt everything behind me getting closer and larger, as I was shrinking down to nothing. The hallway stopped expanding, and suddenly the far end rushed back.
Any mustard can go on a bun, but only the bright flavor of French's makes food sing. Only the bright flavor. Sorry, America's #1 mustard got carried away. French's classic yellow mustard. Add music to every meal. French's, flavor on.
Back towards me. On the wall, speeding ahead, was a lone door that I recognized. The office of our OBGYN. I didn't care. I rushed in and slammed the door. Red moonlight poured in from the windows. I could see Jules in the chair to the right, the one that she always sat in. She wasn't pregnant, and had her face in her hands bawling, but she wasn't alone. I was beside her in the chair to the right, but it wasn't me. It was like a real-life mannequin version of me. Plasticky, shiny, almost waxy. I was grinning from ear to ear. An uncomfortable truth pulsed through me, one that I had kept locked away, deep down even from myself. But it was out now, and my biggest fear had revealed itself. I hadn't wanted Jules to give birth. There was a time when I did, a time that I had looked forward to it, fantasized about being a dad. But now it was different. I didn't think that I could protect Jules or anyone else. I had been growing pessimistic since before the shooting had happened. But after it, all I could see was our kid in that school, blown apart for no reason by some maniac they didn't even know. The attack had all been so pointless. I guess that's why the shooters did it. To hurt everyone by hurting the most vulnerable. To hurt our futures. And they had made me question mine. It was worse than fear, though. It had guilt twisted in through it because it was what Jules and I had wanted. And now I felt like I couldn't be anything other than a massive disappointment. A colossal failure. The wax figure's grin grew larger and the smiling shooter's face flooded my mind. I could tell that he enjoyed the feeling that I had. and realized that it was making him stronger. Every acceptance of it would make him larger and me smaller. Jules screamed out and fell off the chair, clutching her belly. I ran to her side, trying to help. Her stomach was flat, but there was movement under the skin. And then it ballooned outwards, like a rapid growth pregnancy. Jules was crying in pain as she went to full-term size in seconds. The outline of something rigid and bony was shifting under her skin as it expanded outwards. Jules stopped screaming and went limp. She was gone.
Oh god.
But the movements inside of her kept shifting. Then it was humming, a buzzing from inside. A sharp proboscis pierced the skin and tore down the side of Jules' belly. A second proboscis poked out, revealing the frightening face of a moth, though its mouth was filled with the sharp and jagged teeth of other larger creatures. The plastic version of me started laughing, bellowing out from behind me. It was the happiest that he had ever been. Anger burned through me. I grabbed the chair that Jules had been sitting in and slammed it down on the moth. Jules' stomach caved inward as I rained down blows, turning the moth into nothing. As I destroyed the creature, I realized the anger driving me and flowing through my arms was because I did want the baby. I was scared that I wouldn't stack up to the challenge, but I wanted to be her dad. I was reminded of all the positive daydreams that I had of having a baby, a child with Jules. What we would do together and how we would learn and grow. The moth stopped moving. Everything went quiet. I looked down at Jules and felt air leave the room. My heart stopped and rose into my throat. We were back in our apartment. The sun had risen high in the sky now and filled the living room with light. I was standing over Jules, holding one of the stools from the kitchen. It was a horrifying sight. An open cavity now, the remnants of what it once was. It was all done by me. The aftermath dripped from the stool in plops. I dropped it in a daze now, unbelieving of what I had done. I couldn't cry or think. I could barely breathe. I couldn't come to terms with what I had committed in my mind, fractured into millions of acidic thorns. I felt like literal poison. Toxic. A breeze passed through the apartment and I noticed the windows open. It seemed to beckon to me. I couldn't imagine carrying on after this, so I walked towards the window and I climbed up on the edge. The town was calm. It didn't look like anyone else was awake yet. Or maybe I was it. Rick had said that it was an 80% death rate. Maybe it was even more than that. Maybe I had been the only survivor. I didn't care. The world was different now and I didn't want to live in it. I shifted on the ledge, leaning forward, and I felt gravity taking over. Just as my hand left the window frame, a cold, clammy grip latched onto my wrist, pulling me back into the apartment. I landed on the ground hard and felt air fill my lungs like I hadn't breathed in hours. The light in the apartment had changed. The soft glow of the morning sun was just passing between the buildings in the distance, filling the room with warmth. It was dawn. And Jules was standing over me. She was alive, though it looked like she had had one heck of a night. Her belly looked perfectly healthy and untouched. She bent down and hugged me. I realized that I was awake now, really awake. There were no more fears or hallucinations, no more facing the past. We both made it. We cried together for what felt like an hour. 2 days later, the bolts were removed from our doors and the hazmats had arrived again. All surviving tenants of the building were now immune and clear to leave. Jules and I were the only ones. Jules was bombarded with pressure waves and we were rushed to the hospital. We were examined and she gave birth in quarantine to our beautiful, healthy daughter. In the weeks that followed, there was a change between us. The ground below our feet felt more stable. Everyday issues felt so small and easy to overcome. Jules and I had gone to war together and had come back closer than before. I felt my courage and strength grow every day. And I know that Jules did too. Whatever she experienced, she overcame it, same as I did. We still don't know what happened that weekend. We signed NDAs and received a small sum of hush money. The mainstream media were feeding talking points about a natural gas leak in the subway that had caused hallucinations and death. But we know that's not true. We know something leaked out and destroyed most of our small town. And the government somehow contained it and hid it. Hopefully, nothing like it ever leaks out again.
Not bad. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want episode 5. Stuff that I like. What's in my house? Alrighty. Well, like I said, give me a like, a comment. You know, if you subscribe, that'd be great. These things
I think
matter
my
a lot.
grandfather might be
Bye.